It's all too easy to take cheap shots against classic American cars for things like their size, their fuel economy, their horsepower per litre outputs, especially in the 70s, and yet I would say that despite the fact that England is probably the #1 country in the world for making those same stale old jokes, it's also the same country where for every one of those, you'll have 10 or 100 times as many people who point, gawk, comment, grin and stare at any car like this that rolls on by, with mirrored chrome, big fins, opulent interiors, pastel colours and white wall tyres. Yes, we make jokes, but actually, deep down, we love them. And I think one of the reasons why Brits tend to make those jokes is because even though they don't necessarily realise it, they're kind of threatened by them. See, if you were to ask many, many people across the world, back in the day, not so much now, but certainly in the 80s, 70s and further back, what is the best car in the world? What's the finest motor car you can buy? They would almost all say the same thing, from England to America to Dubai. Rolls-Royce. Well, it's a natural, obvious response. And yet, the only place that you'll hear someone perhaps say a different brand, apart from maybe Russia, would be America, because they might say Cadillac. And I think that despite the fact that it doesn't get anywhere near as much respect, and they certainly aren't worth anywhere near as much, which in my opinion is a good thing because it makes them a bargain, Lincoln should and certainly can be on that same pedestal. Because in my opinion, not only in the case of this 1960 Lincoln Premiere Landau, but also in the case of my other car, because spoiler alert, this is of course my car, my latest vehicular purchase. My other car is also a Lincoln, a 1968 Continental Coupe with an even bigger engine and totally different styling. Yet, both of these cars, in my opinion, blow everything from England completely out of the water for their time. Compare this vehicle, a 63-year-old car, to the equivalent Jaguar, which I have driven here on the channel, a Jag Mark II from this same year of 1960, but even to a Rolls-Royce or a Bentley, and I'm sorry to say it, patriotism be damned, we're talking facts here, as I always do, this puts them to shame. Forget Rolls-Royce. I would never swap this car for a Rolls-Royce. I've driven a Rolls-Royce from 1990, and as impressive as it was, it still felt like it was catching up to what this was doing in 1960. Even as far as Cadillac, I would go so far as to say that Cadillac to me also has an element of paying for the badge, like Rolls-Royce does. Yes, Cadillac is fantastic, in the 50s and 60s in particular, but even then, Lincoln is such an under-the-radar dark horse to Cadillac, and more often than not, they are actually at least as good. In fact, in the case of my 1968 Lincoln, they were so good that they were a financial failure, because the whole point of that generation was to outdo Cadillac in every way, which they did. So people who purchased them never bought another car again. They just kept it. So it was a sales disaster. That to me is Lincoln's real legacy. Making cars which don't shout quite as much as a Cadillac, but definitely make at least as much of an engineering impression on you, to the point where if a 29-year-old in 2023 can drive a car from 1960 and tell you that this is genuinely one of the best cars, one of the best pieces of engineering from the perspective of myself as an automotive engineer by trade, that this is legitimately one of the most impressive cars I've ever driven, well, to me that should say something. Now, each can take their own or make jokes about what that says, or what that says about me or my skill, whatever the case may be. The fact is, just compare what this offers. This car had power seats, power windows, power steering, power brakes, auto-dipping headlights. This car was seriously advanced for its time, and not only that, the ironic thing is that most of the biggest jokes that us Brits make about these American cars actually fall completely flat on their face when they come up against any kind of scrutiny. Because consider this, the first thing that we say is that their fuel economy is horrendous. Well, that's up for debate. I get about 11 or 12 to the gallon out of this car personally, and the reality is that from a Rolls-Royce, a Bentley, even a Jag of the time, you're not going to be getting that much more. Certainly not in a Rolls-Royce or a Bentley, and this is from an era when even something like a Mini would have been lucky to get 30 miles per gallon. So let's not act like Britain was leading the charge on fuel economy here. The only things which you could buy that had genuinely good economy were pretty much mopeds or scooters. Secondly, people love to say that these cars were big and massively engined, but not particularly powerful and not particularly quick. Well, again, that is simply false. This particular car that I have, a 1960 shape, which you'll notice I have actually not referred to in the video as a Continental yet, because strangely enough it comes from the time when Ford was trying to make Lincoln and Continental into two different things, because they wanted Continental to be an even higher brand on the spectrum, to even more overtly take on Cadillac, because that was always the rivalry. That didn't really work. They joined them back together, and by the time of the JFK kind of shape, which everyone knows Lincoln for, it was pretty much back to business as usual, which I personally prefer. Technically then, this is not a Lincoln Continental as such, it's a Lincoln Premiere Landau, and then there was a Continental badged version as well. Incidentally, I would also strongly recommend, if you enjoy this video, checking out a video from Leno, who featured his version of this. He's got a, I believe slightly earlier, I want to say 1958, I think it might have been, strawberry red Continental version, and he has the different rear window. So on his, it has the breezeway rear window, which is kind of concave inward with a power window, which is just a great idea for all those exhaust fumes to go into the car, which personally I don't like the look of. It's very Ford Anglia-esque. Mine has the outward bowing rear window, no power, which I think looks way better. I think it much more suits the shape of the car, and for me and for my taste, I think it has aged a lot better as well. But to go back to the point of those engines, this one is actually not as big as my other Lincoln. My other Continental has the 462 MEL engine, which, as memory serves, I think was one of the biggest, if not the biggest Lincoln engine you could get. A 7.6 litre V8, putting down 340 horsepower. So again, people just don't know what they're talking about when they talk about these engines not being powerful. I think most Brits think of all American cars as being like the 70s, with the fuel crisis. That is legitimate, they were awful, but these cars are from before that, back when they actually still had really impressive power. This is actually more impressive than that one, because this is the much more common, still MEL, still a big block Ford motor, but this is the 430, so it's a 7 litre V8. And despite being a motorcycle engine smaller than my other one, a full 600cc less, it still only has a 20 horsepower discrepancy. 320 horsepower in 1960 is a big number. That eclipses something like a Mark II Jag. I believe it's also significantly higher than a Rolls-Royce or even a Bentley of the time, and even more impressively, of course, the torque. These engines are known as bulldozers. They are sheer torque monsters, tugboats of engines that feel like you could easily tow the Titanic. And again, to really put the numbers down on the table, this car is putting out 465 foot-pounds of torque in a car that wasn't even designed for performance. That, to give it some perspective, is the same torque output as a first-generation Dodge Viper in the 90s from an 8 litre V10. That's insane for a car like this. These cars could hit 60 miles an hour in around 8 seconds. That is not slow. In fact, that's just behind something like a 2003 Jaguar XJ6, which is a smaller, far lighter car, with these being literally the biggest generation of Lincoln Continental ever made. This car is another 6 inches longer than my other model, which itself is massive. This is a 227-inch long car. That's about 6 meters or close enough. It's over 80 inches wide, and it's a little bit taller than the 1968 model as well. For a car like this, which weighs at least conservatively 2.5 tons with fuel and a couple of passengers and even minimal luggage, it is a truly massive, an enormous even, vehicle, and it feels such to drive. For a car that's only 2 inches wider than the 68 model, it feels like a hell of a lot more than that, and I love how different, in only 8 years, these two cars feel. And it's one way that I've noticed classic cars they jumped forward in terms of technology and feel and dynamics, much more from decade to decade than we do now. If you compare a 2023 car to a 2013 car, there will be differences, but a 2013 car still holds up really well. Whereas if you compare this 1960 to my 1968, the 68 genuinely feels like a sports car compared to this. It's so much better through corners, the brakes are so much more powerful, having on that model discs on the front from the factory, compared to this one having power drums on the front and the back, which admittedly do a way better job than the drums that I experienced on a Mark II Jag from this same year in a much lighter and what should be much more nimble car. That just didn't hold up, and this holds up so well. Certain things are of course a given. Masses of space, huge trunk, but also in terms of ride quality, comfort, of course they are a given. But I tell you what as well, cars like this to me have so much formed, reformed, and more than anything refined my realization when it comes to enjoying cars. See, I used to buy cars that I thought were really cool. Bentleys, Jags, Maseratis, Golf R32s, Evo 7s, and I loved all of them for very different reasons. But I realised as soon as I bought that first Lincoln, and then when I had the 66 Ford, and now with this one more so even than those other two, there is nothing to me that brings me more joy as a petrol head than seeing the joy that my car brings to other people. See, there are two types of flashy car that you can buy. There's the type of flashy car that makes everyone think you're trying to prove something. Fill in the blank on a brand. I'm sure we can all think of one. The car is all about you. It's about getting people to notice you, to imagine how much money you must make, and to think, oh, that guy, that girl, that whoever have arrived. They're a badass, they're cool, they're whatever. Then there's cars like this. When I show up, for example, to, say, the Haynes Breakfast Club, as I have in this car, and as I doubtless will again, this doesn't look like I'm the richest person there. In fact, somewhat ironically, cars like this, not least of which because of being a Lincoln, which doesn't hold as much value as a Cadillac, it's ironically probably one of the most affordable cars to show up to the Breakfast Club, and yet it attracts more attention than virtually everything else. It looks like I drove it out of the museum and straight into the car park. There's just something about certain cars through time, and these represent that to a T. They are just cars that bring everyone joy. They bring joy to you as the owner who gets to drive it. There are people who go to meets and shows who love looking around cars. When I took this car to its first Breakfast Club at the aforementioned Haynes meet, when I opened the doors, the bonnet, the boot, it immediately drew crowds, and it had crowds, and I mean crowds, around it all morning. Even when I didn't even bother standing with the car, I was walking around looking at other stuff, there was always, when I'd look back over my shoulder, so many people around the car, and I would often let people sit in the car and enjoy it, because to me that's what it's about. This is not a car that's designed to make me look good, it's a piece of drivable art from a time that, yes, was a long time ago, but in many ways has stood up to the test of time so outstandingly well that it really is kind of an unarguable pointer, one of the many, depending on your brand of choice when it comes to classic American stuff. And there are so many different ones that everyone has their own preference. For me, clearly it's Lincoln. But any of these really go to show beyond, to be honest, any shadow of a doubt and any argument beyond just simple patriotism, that America really was legitimately making the best cars in the world in the 50s and 60s. Even compared to your Bentleys, your Rolls-Royces, your whatever else. They were so far ahead of everything else on the market that it's not even funny. The fact that a car like this can even be driven today by someone of my age with modern traffic and actually be used as I use these as my daily drivers over 100 miles a week and still even be useful for that, but also be a vehicle that I'm not scared to take out because it's not worth as much as an E-Type, a Daytona, a fill in the blank. It means that it's in such a beautiful sweet spot wherein it's a car that looks $1 million, but that you can freely use without worrying too much about a scratch here or a little bit of dirt there or some extra mileage, because you don't really have anything to prove and you don't have any kind of value to maintain. If it goes up in value, great. If it doesn't, that's also great. And to me, I think that's one of the things that I love the most about these Lincolns. If this were a Cadillac, it would be worth more, but I'd be paying a lot more to get it in the first place, and what would I really gain? Some people might recognise the badge, I'd get some extra resale value, I guess, in the long run. I don't buy cars for that. If you're buying cars for an investment, sure, but if you're buying a classic to use it, I can obviously wholeheartedly recommend a Lincoln, because even if you get a fuel crisis car, which of course I would not recommend as much, but even if you go for one of them, you just get so much of everything you would want from that experience for so much less money than any of their equivalent other cars. So to me, although this might be a little bit of a different review, as of course it has to be, because for many people a third generation Lincoln Continental is not the kind of car that pops up at your local dealership every weekend, which is exactly the reason why I thought I had to have this one, and I don't regret the purchase at all. To me, Lincolns represent such a superb choice of classic car. If you are an American car fan, if you've always dreamed of a classic American car in the vein of your big Cadillacs, Duesenbergs, Lincolns, that kind of stuff, I would say that Lincoln is definitely the first place that you should look. Because even though they're still not super common, they're never particularly expensive, at least here in the UK, because most of them don't tend to be show queens anyway. They have decent mileage, they have some use, they have some things here and there which might need to be updated or fixed. But again, that's part of the charm. And what you're getting is a car that shares a lot of parts with other models. The MEL engine, for example, is Mercury, Edsel, Lincoln. So even within Ford, it had multiple uses. That makes it so much easier to live with, though. Having that built-in infrastructure of a big brand with Ford behind it, thousands of units sold, it all adds to the experience of having a car which looks as incredible as this does inside and out, but also knowing that 9 times out of 10, you can probably find the parts you need. And that is something which, if you own, say, a Marcos or an old TVR or maybe an old Shelby, would probably be considerably more difficult. And it goes far beyond just those. Old Maseratis, an old Ferrari, an Aston, a Jag, those parts could sometimes cost a lot. And the more obscure the brand you go for, of course, that's going to be exaggerated. For me, this is exactly my kind of purchase, exactly my kind of car. I adore how different this car, which I call Mary Todd, is to my other Lincoln, Abe. And to me, Lincoln is one of the most slept on brands in the world, because they are every bit as good as Cadillacs, and yet they are a fraction of the cost. No one gives them anywhere near the kind of respect that Cadillac gets. And much like how Bentley was often in the shadow of Rolls-Royce but makes incredible cars, likewise with Lincoln. So for me, that's my overall thoughts from a bit more of an academic sense on this side of things. I'm personally very happy that the Continental and Lincoln names reformed after this generation, and to me this also represents kind of the pinnacle of the 50s. My 68 car represents everything great about the 60s that culminated into that right before the fuel crisis, and to me this is everything great about the over-the-top excess of the 1950s with the fins, the chrome, the aviation inspiration, and puts it all into one car. The dawn of a new decade, but very distinctly still in the 50s in the best ways. They're cars that look like museum pieces, but kind of feel like muscle cars underneath, and that makes them so much more usable. And incidentally, don't get bogged down in the weeds trying to find the specific naming of cars like this, because you've got the Lincoln Continental Mark V, or a Continental Mark III, or a Lincoln Mark V, or a Lincoln Premiere Landau. There's so many ridiculous different names that they called these things, and they're all basically the same platform. So you can very much get into the weeds. For me, I refer to this as a Lincoln Continental Premiere, which technically it isn't, but it also is. So ultimately, that is it for my review on my 1960 Lincoln Continental Premiere Landau. I hope you've enjoyed it. I certainly do. And who knows, maybe if you live in the south of the UK, you might see me at some shows. But until next time, I'll see you then. Of course, you can check out my review on my 1968 model and my aforementioned 66 Galaxy, as well as modern cars as well here on the channel. And until next time, I'll see you then. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.